Welcome back to the Ladakh Literature Festival of 2020. Our session for today is Politics and the Art of Non-Fiction, a conversation between Rinchan Robo and Vinay Sitapati. How do you objectively write about political events and political figures? Speaking to acclaimed writer Vinay Sitapati, author of HalfLife, The Man Who Remade India, and recently Jugalbandi, the BJP before Modi, we seek to understand the process of accurately chronicling key events in modern and contemporary history.
Today we have Vinay Sitapati, author and assistant professor of political science and legal studies at Ashoka University. After his stellar debut with Half-Lion, How P.V. Narasimha Rao Transformed India in 2017, Vinay is now out with his much anticipated second book titled Jugalbandi, the BJP before Modi. Welcome to the Ladakh Literature Festival, Vinay. First of all, many congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much, Rinchan. In fact, I think the only sadness that I have is that, we couldn't actually do this in Ladakh. I think it's fast becoming #1 tourist destination in India. I would have loved to be there. So Zoom is good, but it's not as good as actually being in Ladakh. And hopefully as sort of COVID begins to recede, more and more people like me get to go to Ladakh.
Absolutely. This would have been ideal if you did this in Leh. I mean, it would have been perfect, actually. But yeah, so before we get into the topic for the day, which is politics and the art of nonfiction, could you sort of very briefly tell our audience what the book is all about?
So Rinchan, the book, it's a big book, but don't get intimidated because it has 100 pages footnotes. So the book itself is 300 pages, and you'll be able to finish it very quickly. And those who have, and and the book is already it's about 8 days, but we've already been in the Amazon top 100 for the much of this week. So book is doing well. So just to tell your readers, don't get intimidated by the fact that it has this scholarly tone, and since you've read Half-Life, you know that I also put a lot of masala, and masala is very important for me because, like, for me, the reader is king and queen. So the heart of this book, Rinchan, is to answer a very simple question. For a lot of people, this new idea of India, which is typified by Narendra Modi, seems so sudden, right? That for much of us, we are used to either a period of Congress domination or a period of coalition politics. So some of us wonder, where on earth did Narendra Modi come from? And the point of this book is to tell you that actually Narendra Modi is 100 years in the making. And if you have to understand this new idea of India, you have to begin in the 1920s. And it's been a very long journey. It's just that we have not been paying attention. And the book is told, this 80-year prehistory to Narendra Modi is told through the two founders of the BJP, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Lal Krishna Advani. So even if you're not interested in politics per se, this is a story of a relationship. And it's a story of a relationship about how a relationship navigates ups and downs. So when hierarchy begins to slowly change in a relationship, all of us have gone through this, right? We have a best friend, the friend may be a bit junior. Then, we begin to think differently. We go a little further apart. But nonetheless, it's required to be together to achieve a certain goal. And that's sort of, in some sense, the second narrative of this book. If the first narrative is, you need to read this book to understand today, the second narrative is, how do you make a relationship work and last over a period of 60 years, even when the going gets tough?
It works generally for people who are not just interested in politics, but for a general audience as well, because you're also telling a story of a relationship as well. So my first question essentially is, what what inspired you to write this book in the first place? I mean, and when did the idea of writing about this subject first sort of struck you?
So Rinchan, I think I'm, to date myself, I'm a decade older than you are. So I grew up in Bombay, in Bandra, actually, of the 1990s. So I'm a child of the 1990s. And Rinchan, my father left a PSU or a government job to, try to make it in the private sector. Was tough. So that, this idea of liberalization, something that, somebody of your age, Rinchan, is a bit of a distant memory, was very much part of my growing up, that, India is changing, markets are opening up. But with that comes a lot of dislocation, trying to get off grips with this new India. And I remember in 1995, or 96, standing in line in Linking Road near my house in Bandra as the first McDonald's in India opened. And there was a huge line, stretching kilometers. So my first book, in some sense, on Narasimha Rao was to make sense of liberalization, was to make sense of India moving from a command-controlled socialist economy into a more kind of, you can say, pro-market or at least pro-capital economy. And what was the human story there? And there I realized that transformation was one man, Narasimha Rao. It wasn't the tide of history. Because a lot of my fellow academics feel that, in Hindi we say sab likha hua hai, that if something happens, they'll say it's inevitable. And in some sense, I was pushing against this idea when it came to liberalization. As a child of the 90s, the second kind of ghost that haunted me was the rise of the BJP. That was the first bloom of the lotus. The BJP begins to rise in the 80s and comes to power in 96, 98, and once again from 99 to 2004 under Prime Minister Vajpayee. So, I felt that if I had to kind of try to understand this first rise of the BJP, which ends with Narendra Modi and Amit Shah entering the national stage, I should do a biography of Vajpayee. But very quickly, Rinchan, and those of your viewers who are researchers who want to write, one thing you realize is that you have a certain idea. And then you go in and research tells you that you should move in a different direction, and you should. I think it's very wrong to get stuck to. It's important to have an original idea or an idea or a hypothesis going in. But when you realize that facts don't match up to that, you should change your mind. It's not like you should not rest on false pride. That's something I learned. So I learned very quickly that the Vajpayee story, the other side of the coin, was the Advani story. That one was a parliamentarian, one was the face, the other was the organizer, the other was a muscle. So in some sense, I realized very quickly that it was a Jugalbandi. And for those of you who don't know the word, I'm sure you all have heard of the word Jugalbandi, but Jugalbandi is usually used in a musical, in an Indian classical music concert, where you have different musicians. So it's not a duet. It's different musicians who normally shouldn't be playing together, but they play together and they make music. And the second definition of Jugalbandi is that this is an equal music. There's no soloist and accompanist. They both are soloists playing together. And in that sense, I realized that I should tell the story of Vajpayee and Advani. But equally, Rinchan, I realized that as I got into the heart of the Vajpayee-Advani story, I realized that actually their story is a mirror of the rise of the BJP. And actually, Jugalbandi, or people who are different from each other working together as a team, is the organizational ideology of the BJP. It's why they win, Rinchan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that is the thing. A lot of commentators, even today, for example, tend to have a very distinct notion of who Advani was and who Vajpayee was. Vajpayee being the more sort of secular, cosmopolitan sort of individual, and Advani the more hardline sort of, a version of the BJP, which is not necessarily the case. I mean, and I think one of the reasons why, given the excerpts that I've already read so far, I think why people should read this book is because I think it completely shatters some of those myths about these two sort of stalwarts of, modern Indian politics. Transitioning from there, so could you tell us as to sort of how long conduct research and write this book? How long was that process?
It took me 3 years, but I was also kind of teaching, I also have a family. So, I wouldn't say that I was doing this 100% of the time, but it took me 3 years. The Narasimha Rao book, on the other hand, took me just 1 year, but on the other hand, I was doing nothing else. I was just finished my PhD. I had, money to work to basically work uninterrupted. Whereas this told me that, look, a book, you can't just hold, go to like a resort and, close your door and work for 2 years. You have to work on a book alongside living an actual life. But to come back to the other point that you made just now in the question about Vajpayee and Advani being the moderate and the hardliner, I complicate this in two ways. Firstly, I tell you that their social origins are quite different from this. LK Advani is like me, an English-speaking type, which is, by the way, a phrase used derisively by the RSS. Right? They feel that the people in India who are native English speakers, for whom English is the first language, are a colonial hangover and don't really understand culture. That was Advani. He learned English before he learned Hindi. He came from a very wealthy trading family in Karachi. The Karachi of the 20s and the 30s was like Bombay. It was a cosmopolitan part of British Empire. You have all kinds of communities who are living there. LK Advani's family is actually not is a very ecumenical or very syncretic idea of religion. Even though he is a Hindu, in his house they had Sikh rituals being practiced. His own mother used to go to a Muslim Sufi shrine. So that was the syncretic world that he grew up in. And I point out that he would never have become a hardliner, and if we would never have joined the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or the RSS if it hadn't been for the looming catastrophe of partition. Once again, I think our generation forgets what a cataclysmic event that was. That suddenly overnight, Advani's idea of his Sindhi identity being part of India is shattered. Sindh is now part of Pakistan. And two, and as importantly, just the very rich Advanis become near penniless refugees who have to scrounge around in India. It's a tragic story. And out of this tragedy comes Advani's fierce sense of loyalty to both the ideology as well as the discipline of Hindu nationalism. Vajpayee, on the other hand, comes from a very parochial, provincial, Gangetic Brahmin family from Uttar Pradesh, what is today Uttar Pradesh, but he grew up in Gwalior. So his own social background, one would argue, should be associated with someone like Yogi Adityanath, right? But as I tell you in this book, they end up reversing roles, and I think that's why it's important to read, just read a book that charts a journey, because it kind of complicates a little bit the pre-existing stereotypes that people have when they think about today's politics.
Absolutely, I really couldn't agree more on this point. Now, so could you sort of take us through the process of writing this book? Sort of how did you conduct research for this book, and what kind of sources did you sort of cite, and more importantly, how do you determine their authenticity?
So, Rinchan, I'm afraid that this is likely to be a boring answer, but I want to underline this because those of you who will read this book will say, look, this has a lot of masala, it has love affairs, it has tragedy, it had passion, it has all the ingredients of a good Bollywood film, right? But yet it has, I think, about 1,800 footnotes, and that's what I'm very proud about. That there's not a single line or in this book that you could question. You could question my opinions, and I'm okay with that. But in this kind of Trumpian post-fact world, what I wanted to say was that this book had to be bulletproof, right? And in order to, and so far, Rinchan, I've got a lot of reviews from the left and from the right. And I haven't, there are people who disagree with some arguments here, there, but nobody's really called into question the book. And the answer to that, I'm afraid, for your readers is a boring answer, which is the process of actually researching. I've already talked about the process of selecting a question, a research question, which is kind of looking at the Vajpayee-Advani relationship as a mirror for the rise of the BJP and Hindu nationalism. And I showed you how coming to that question wasn't linear. It wasn't a straight line. And that's a good thing about research, which is that you have, research is all about going on into sort of, dead ends, going on to rabbit holes. And then if you realize you're wrong, you have to quickly extricate yourself, right? That's very important when it comes to research. Have a hypothesis. So don't go in without a hypothesis. But once you have your hypothesis is wrong, quickly exit and look for a new hypothesis. If your hypothesis is right, dig a little deeper, So the first thing I did after having this kind of a research question is to read up what anyone else had written about the subject. And I point out in the book, I think that's about 200 articles and books. I know it sounds like a lot, but 200 articles, each about 25, 30 pages, that's not a lot. Books take a lot of time. But that's important because on a subject like this, Rinchan, everybody and their uncle has a view. I'm not
Absolutely.
like, on the other hand, when it came to Narasimha Rao, very few people had heard of him. So I was kind of rescuing an unknown figure. But here there's no question. This is the central question in India right now. So it was very important for me to pay respect to others who've written about it. The next step was to go into what we call primary material, which is that original material, not what others have written about it. This could be, for example, newspapers written on that day. So from say the 1920s, the 1910s itself, I was looking at local newspapers. Times of India archives are available online from the late 19th century. You have to pay for it on ProQuest, but it's available. For Hindu, for Indian Express, for Jansatta, I had to travel to Delhi. I had to travel to Chennai, to the physical newspaper locations to look for archives. And also I looked at places like Nehru Memorial, National Archives, where you have these early newspapers, including the RSS in-house newspaper, or now magazine called Organizer, which is on microfilm, right? And I hope that some of you, after seeing this video, Google what a microfilm is, because for all of you it may seem like an artifact, but for me it's a real present thing, and it's a huge pain, right? So, and yes, we would like a digitization project, but digitization for some of this is some decades away, and I don't want to wait for a decade. So that's the other thing about research. To quote Donald Rumsfeld, and I know I'm not the best person to quote. You go to war with the army you have. So you have a research question, and then you find that there's some research in Delhi, some in Chennai, some on microfilm. But that's it. You can't wait for this idea of perfection, because the one thing I tell my own students, Rinchin, is that perfection is the enemy of production. If you're waiting for this mythic moment where everything is perfect, where you've read the last book on the BJP, you'll never start writing. So I looked at newspapers. Then I also looked at archives of parties and private archives. So for example, Hindu Mahasabha archives. I looked at the archives of the BJP itself. The BJP has a very fancy library now in northern Delhi. And as I argue in the book, they're obsessed with organizations. They keep photos, they keep documents of everything. I also looked at private archives of V.D. Savarkar, who's in some sense the intellectual godfather of Hindu nationalism. I also got access to the private archives of, for example, the lawyer of Vajpayee and Advani. And are very important because they record everything in writing, right? So that was very helpful. I got archives, so quite a bit like that. So that was also very helpful, because you get, and some of these are personal archives. They're letters written by BJP leaders to their sons and daughters who may be in the US or who may be elsewhere. And some of it is, I'm eating like rice and dal today kind of thing. But embedded within that would be that yesterday we had a national executive meeting where Vajpayee behaved like this, Advani behaved like this, completely private. So you can trust that a little more, because that person is not writing it in order to peddle it. It was meant to be a absolutely private archive. And then finally, Rinchin, the heart of the book is about 200 interviews that I've done, of which about little less than 100 are being quoted in the book. But unlike the Narasimha Rao book, this is a sensitive book. So many people, especially those in government today, didn't want their names. They were happy to talk to me and they were happy to tell me things, but they didn't want their names. And even the quotes I had to engineer in a way that couldn't plausibly be traced back to them, right? Wow. That takes a lot of effort, and I realized, Rinchin, that I had two people to please in some sense, or I had two. One was the reader, which is the most important. If you're writing a book, you're writing it for a reader. Know who your reader is. The second is you have to be honest to the sources, because sources are trusting you. And that doesn't mean that you write everything the source says. Sometimes the source is lying. Sometimes the source is unwittingly sort of telling you a story where that source is the hero or the heroine, and you have to
embellishing it. Yeah.
You have to do that. But at the same time, if you're honest and transparent, sources tend to respect you. I find, ironically, that if you do exactly what the source says, sources will kind of give you things, but they won't respect you, because they know that you don't have a spine. And if you don't have a spine, that means an enemy of the source is as likely to manipulate you as the source itself. So it's that dealing with sources is a hard method that I can't just put it into a box and sort of explain it to you right now. But think about it, about building any other relationship in your life with your parents, your spouse, your significant other, your friends. Like, how do you build a relationship of trust? And that's what I was trying to do, both with my sources as well as with my reader.
Absolutely. And sort of this makes it very easy for me to transition into my next question, which is, so you've been both a journalist in your early career and later on a student of law and political science. So how does training in these disciplines sort of enable you to write such a book?
So Rinchin, I think the answer is in two ways. Firstly, I'm trained as a lawyer. So I studied in National Law School, Bangalore, India's #1 law school, and did my master's at Harvard Law School, which is the world's #1 law school. Then, of course, I'm a crazy guy, so I decided not to make a lot of money. And I also realized very quickly that neither did I have a passion or the talent. And talent is very important in these things. So I don't want to just make myself sound better than I am, to make it on Wall Street. I realized that my interests kind of lie elsewhere. And then I worked for a couple of years as a journalist with Indian Express, a fantastic place with really stalwart journalists like Rajkamal Jha and Shekhar Gupta. Taught me a lot about the worm's eye view of politics, because in academia we learn the bird's eye view, but the worm is able to see something often that the bird is not able to see. And then I spent 6 years doing my PhD at Princeton University in political science. So I learned a lot about rigor, about footnotes, etc., etc. And I think this diverse experience has taught me two things. One is, on a lighter note, it's taught me that there's a lot of fluff and faff associated with these professions and disciplines. And a lot of that is just to make that discipline seem better than it is. And because I have experience of three such professions, I can very quickly take what is valuable and remove stuff that is absolutely not. So, Rinchin, as a journalist yourself, I'm sure you agree with me that, there's, let's say, 50 to 60% of journalism is valuable. The other is a certain way of writing, a certain way of commenting that becomes a form of jargon so that it prevents other people from writing, right? So it's actually an artificial entry barrier that distinguishes journalists from other people, because if everybody could write, then why would you have journalists? So as I said, some of it is skill, right? But some of it is also just, the way you write a lead or the way you should write a story. There's no particular formula for that, but that formula, especially on the news desk, I'm sure you'll agree with me, has been set in stone basically to distinguish copy editors and journalists from other people who also write pretty well, right? That's the same logic that I found in law, that, law taught me a lot. It taught me the importance of footnotes. It taught me the importance of that facts are sacred. You don't have a right to your own facts. Lawyers are kind of, this is drilled into lawyers, right? So for example, when I was, I have a very carefully written 2 or 3 pages on Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. And I asked the question, did the RSS do it, right? Very sensitive. And look, if I found evidence that the RSS did it, I would have written it, right? Because I'm an independent scholar. But what I do find, and you can read that in the book, is the institutions of the RSS and Hindu nationalism had no role. In fact, the killing of Mahatma Gandhi hurt them for the next 2-3 decades. On the other hand, the killers of Mahatma Gandhi shared the ideology of the RSS, in that the same criticism that the RSS had of Gandhi was shared by Nathuram Godse. But that doesn't mean they wanted to kill him, right? But in order to answer this question, I have to look at the court judgments. I have to look at the court submissions. I have to weigh and assess evidence. So I think that part about my law training helped me a lot. But once again, as a lawyer and, as somebody who's done a lot of law internship, I very quickly realized that 50% of law is simply fact, that it's basically, there's a way in which you're supposed to write a petition. It's not, if you read any Supreme Court judgment, 50% may make value, but 50% is just written in a way that, is protecting the judge from being laughed at, right? Or
it's just embellished prose.
Yes, and you're doing it because to give a sound of profundity when actually you're not trying to say something. And if you write in simple English, people will laugh at you. And if you write in simple English, a lot of people will realize, you know what, we can be a lawyer also. Why are we paying so much money for a lawyer? And Richard, it's the same thing with academia. That again, I learned so much from academia that I was not possible just as a lawyer or a journalist to read secondary literature, for example, to take causation seriously. That why the BJP wins is a causal question, right? And I can't just say it's a bit of A, B, C, D. I have to say, why is it A and B and why is it not C and D? And I have to defend that with evidence. So those are good things that academia teaches you. But anyone who's read an academic article realizes that about 50% of it is just written in a way that is not understandable, because otherwise somebody will say, wait a minute, why did you get a PhD for writing that? Why are you an academic? So again, it's not that it's some conspiracy that individual academics are doing. Academia as an institution likes, any profession likes to create these entry barriers to basically give them an artificial value boost compared to others. And I'm very grateful to God that because I saw intimately 3 professions, I know what to take, which is good in all of them, which actually makes, there is value to having these 2 law degrees, right? But there's also a lot of faff and BS. And it's to separate the wheat from the chaff. If I was just a lawyer or just an academic or just a journalist, I wouldn't be able to have this detector to take what is good and totally ignore what actually adds no value. And you know what, Rinchin, readers know that. Like, readers respect and appreciate the fact if your book adds value in terms of footnotes or adds value in terms of a watertight argument. But once you begin to use jargon, readers are able to sense very quickly that you're pulling a fast one on that. And you know what? Readers have the ultimate power. They can just shut the book. That's it. So readers will always ultimately win any argument you're having with them.
And this I particularly find, in academia. I mean, when I read academic papers, when I'm researching on, for example, on a certain historical event, first of all, they're very long. Second of all, they're very dense. And so once you add a lot of jargon to it, it just completely puts you off. And then you just, I struggle through it and sort of eventually get down to what I'm looking for, but it's a real struggle. And similarly with court judgments, Supreme Court judgments, particularly in the recent years. But and with respect to journalism, I think also I'll just add another point to it. I mean, this is my personal opinion about it, which is that the barriers to entry to journalism are pretty low in that sense. I mean, anyone with a bachelor's degree in sort of any subject, if he has the right sort of skill sets, instincts, and and the sort of thirst for sort of, and is just curious as hell, can definitely sort of, I would argue, make it. I've seen a lot of folks in this profession who who studied all sorts of different things, but they ended up doing journalism. And I always ask them, how do you land up here? I mean, I actually sort of studied journalism for a bit, like as a subject, but a lot of these guys haven't, but they've done a remarkably good job with their careers. So I think with journalism, at least in my opinion, I think it's a little less. Right. And I think that also shows with the way, the disdain with which a lot of common folk treat journalists today.
Yeah, no, I think fair. I think that's a well taken. That's a well taken point.
Yeah. So next question is, can a writer of non-fiction, particularly when dealing with a contentious subject like politics, remain truly objective? Now, in the sense that, how difficult is it to shed your own ideology and prejudices when writing a book like this?
It is difficult, Rinchin. So it's a good question you ask, because they say in Alcoholics Anonymous that admitting you have a problem is 50% of the solution. So first, when you're writing a book like this, right, first admit that this is to the author, like I had to admit to myself, look, it's a sensitive question, right? There's no Indian who doesn't have a strong view on this. There's no Indian. There's no Indian who will be lukewarm about this book. I can tell you that, right? And so I have to be honest to myself what my biases and prejudices are. This is very important, because a lot of scholars, I find, think that the way they view the world is the only way the world is viewed, and then they think the purpose of academia or scholarship is to disseminate this view to the gullible reader. And you know what? The reader is not a fool. The reader realizes that, right? At the same time, Rinchin, I think readers don't expect writing that conforms to their worldview, right? Just think about, I would encourage your viewers to just look at their own friend circle. There'll be people who disagree with them on politics, on personality. You'll have even family members who have very different views on things. So that kind of diversity is something that we're used to. It's not a big deal, But what you want is an honesty and transparency. So what I try to do here is, while being pretty clear about what my views are on the BJP, right, I try my best to tell the reader, look, that is not the point of this book, right? If you can smell where I'm coming from, good for you, right? But I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to give you 1,800 footnotes. So every time you have a worry about where my sources, you can check for yourself, right? Where I'm trying to tell you my opinion, you can see it, right? And I totally respect that you can come to a different kind of opinion. And I spend a lot of energy doing this. And, many people who've read this, like I just recently did an interview with Barkha Dutt, and she told me that, look, reading your book didn't make me angry, and I think that's what I would love. I would love people, and I can guarantee you this book is not going to make you angry, right? Because a lot of political writing is meant to kind of trigger you, right? Especially on Twitter, on Facebook. That's not the point of this book. This book is asking a pretty simple question. You like it or not, the BJP is the dominant view in India. Treat them, even if you hate them, at least respect your enemy and understand your enemy. One of the things, Rinchin, I found quite remarkable about the BJP and RSS, as I told you, I interviewed totally about 200 people, so I met a lot of them, is that they read Wire, they read Scroll, They know what criticisms of the RSS and BJP are out there. They know that. And they take it, and some they ignore, some they kind of act on. But I found that I think Amit Shah and Narendra Modi take the Congress a lot more seriously than the Congress takes them, And I think that's very important, which is that, the point of this book is to tell you, take these people seriously, even if you dislike them, or especially if you dislike them. And the aim of a book like this, Rinchin, is not to convert you, right? I'm not a proselytizer. So if you hate the BJP and read this book is not going to change your opinion. And if you like the BJP and read this book, it's not going to change your opinion. It's just going to give you a 100-year set of facts and argument, so that your arguments for or against are more nuanced. And look, it's a balancing act, because in India today, trying to kind of, I wouldn't say objective, but trying to tell the reader that the point of a book is more than just making you angry and more than just kind of converting you to the author's opinion. People on both sides of the aisle are very suspicious. What's this guy doing, right? And I can tell you that people are, but once they read the book, it's not. So I've got a review by, in a center-right magazine by a leading RSS thinker who said, look, first, this is the first English-speaking guy who understands us, right? And equally, I've got, reviews in left liberal magazines saying, look, read this book to understand why the BJP is so hard to beat. And it's a very, very hard act to do. And I may still slip. These are early days. But I think the heart is admitting where you're coming from, right? And writing a book where that's not the central point of the book. And readers, I'm now able to realize readers are much smarter than we give them credit for. They're able to sense this very quickly, right? Even if they place you, they are willing to engage with you as long as they think that you're being honest in what you're trying to do. And you're trying to create, the book is adding value to their lives other than just kind of drilling an ideology into their minds. Readers are like that.
I mean, God knows we need more like this, because at least the intent behind writing books like this, because everything today is so polemical.
Yes.
Everything today is, it's dealt in binaries. Everything is sort of, it's always a clash of heads. It's always these culture wars. It's always these things. And in the midst of all this, you lose track of the complexity of each individual and each historical figure. Like the thing about Advani that you talked about earlier, that he grew up in this sort of democratic, sort of very sort of secular environment, but partition, the circumstances of partition, I mean, it can change anybody, and sort of it is books like these that also humanize these individuals who, for example, if you are in the left or left liberal camp, they've always sort of demonized Advani as, as this sort of rabid sort of figure. But, when you read a book like this, you understand, okay, this is where he started. This is what happened. These are the circumstances that led to where he is today, where he eventually got. So, I mean, and it's through telling these stories that you actually learn about the other side.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we need more such work.
But also, while I do sort of complicate this left liberal narrative of Advani as a monster, I also complicate the left liberal veneration for Vajpayee. Right?
Exactly.
I say that, look, yes, he was a great prime minister, but in 2002 he did not carry through on his demand that Narendra Modi be sacked as Gujarat chief minister. And even though he opposed the Ram Mandir movement to build a temple atop the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya, ultimately he was a party man. And after the Babri Masjid demolition, he actually defended his party in parliament. So the aim is to complicate that. It's not to say that, oh, left liberals, your framing is wrong. It's also to tell the right that your framing is wrong sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And also, Rinchin, this idea of neutrality, that's why I didn't want to use the word. I'm not saying cop-out, like I was having an interview with somebody who correctly pointed out that, a neutrality is, the word neutrality in journalism is that you talk to somebody who says it's raining, and then you talk to somebody who says it's not raining, and then you write, X said it was raining, Y said it was not raining. Whereas as a journalist, what you should really do is look out of the window, right? So I'm not like, that's why, the word neutrality and objectivity, I want to keep aside to push for honesty and transparency, and where I think the BJP deserve criticism on Gujarat, for example, I'm quite clear, right? I don't like, it's because I am an independent scholar. I don't have an angle, right? And the only angle I have is that the reader shouldn't think that because I have like a worldview, I'm trying to topo the worldview on the reader. So that's why it's a delicate balance that you want to calm people down, but you don't want to calm people down at the cost of not seeing injustice. So how do you have that balance? And it's I mean, I don't have a formula, just to tell your viewers. But as I said, with Alcoholics Anonymous, admitting you have a problem is half the solution. So at least thinking about this constantly and being self-aware, you tend to be a little more sensitive, and readers appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really couldn't agree more on this point. And so finally, sort of, what are some of the things you found out during your research for this book that you hadn't known earlier?
Oh, quite a lot. For example, the heart of the book, Rinchin, is to argue that the BJP wins. I mean, there are many reasons the BJP wins, but the most unstudied one is that they don't split. That think about it. The Congress is splitting every week. Even single caste parties like the Samajwadi Party or the Bahujan Samaj Party splits, right? Because of family tensions, like in the case of Samajwadi Party. The communists are constantly splitting into CPI, CPIM, and the overground and the underground on the basis of ideology. And this has calamitous effects on on electoral success. One of the many reasons why the BJP wins, and a constant one, is that Jugalbandi is part of the ideology, that they just don't split. They have this ethic of teamwork. And if you want to find out what this Hindu Fevicol is, I call it Hindu Fevicol in the book, then you should read this book, which is what is this secret sauce. But I am pointing out that, and I didn't realize this at all. I mean, I went in and look, I had views on what the BJP is because I am an academic. I do teach political science. I have done a PhD. But I think that's the big thing I didn't realize, that this obsession with organizational unity is so important, right? The other thing I realized, which I didn't earlier, was that, my basic instinct was perhaps the BJP is a fascist party, it's anti-democratic. And I realized that I was confusing terminology. The BJP is an illiberal party in that it focuses on groups, but most Indians live like that. Most Indian parties are group-based parties. They are not, even the Congress at the local level is a group-based party. It appeals to Brahmins, Dalits, Muslims. It doesn't appeal to individuals, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, the BJP is no different. It's just that it's been able to create the biggest group of them all. And the obsession the BJP has with winning elections, right, is, as I realize in the book, because the BJP is constituted by elections, that when the British introduced elections in India in the 1920s, early Hindu nationalists says, we love elections because political individualism, one person, one vote, works very well for a community that is a social majority in that country, right? Why shouldn't they like it? It's just that the 100-year task of the BJP is to make Hindus of various castes, region, and languages vote as one solid block. And the culmination of that 100-year dream is Narendra Modi. He does it better than anyone else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, and also along these lines of, and this sort of my final sort of question is this. So after this book, after all the the work that has gone into this, and, now you're hundreds and hundreds of interviews every other day. What next? What's up? What's next for you after this?
Well, Rinchin, one is that now I'm focused on the translations. So the book is coming out in Hindi in January. It's coming out in a few days in Telugu. So those of your readers who read Hindi and Telugu, a book is going to come out very soon. It'll come out and we are just about to sign a contract for 20 different translations in 20 different languages. Because, for me, one of the reasons I came back after Harvard University and Princeton to India is that, I think in English. In that sense, I'm the enemy of the RSS culturally, but I don't want my ideas to only remain in the English world. So I think the next year I'll be working with translators and coming out with various editions. And look, it's hard, right? Because there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of sparkle attached to Indian writing in English, and that's less so in various languages. But you know what? A lot of people still access information, stories, a sense of politics in languages other than English, and so that's what I'm going to do. And the larger point, what next as an idea, I don't know, right? Let me think about it. But whatever, I can assure you one thing, Rinchin, that if I continue to be true to my research instincts, whatever initial idea I have will change significantly by the time I finish the book. And frankly, that's a good thing.
Spoken like a true academic. Spoken like a true academic. Anyway, Vinay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. And many congratulations on your book. I'm so looking forward to reading this. I can't even tell you. Thank you, and good luck. And good luck with the translations, because a lot of people access the politics through the vernacular.
Yes.
The political imaginations are drawn through the vernacular. So I think it's incredibly important that you're getting this work translated as well. And good luck with that. Good luck with that.
Thanks, Vincent. And I hope to see you next year for the next edition of this festival in Ladakh, along with a lot of your viewers who I hope also travel to Ladakh. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.